Dr. David Scott is an anaesthetist and a reservist in the Australian Air Force. He's also the immediate past president of the Australian Society of Anaesthetists. He has had many deployments overseas to Bougainville, the Solomon Islands, East Timor and Afghanistan. His role in the tsunami relief effort in Indonesia in 2004 saw him awarded a meritorious service citation by the New South Wales government. But it also had a profound emotional effect on him. In this deeply personal interview, he discusses his military and civilian careers, his contributions to the ASA, and the importance of caring for your mental health and that of your colleagues. David, thank you so much for coming to the college today to talk with us. It's really nice to have you here.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to it, and it's a true honour and a privilege to be here.
So David, can you start by telling me a little about your early medical training?
So I went to Newcastle Medical School and I was in the 4th intake. So it was an interesting opportunity because no one had graduated from the course at that time. The school was new, there was a lot of enthusiasm, a lot of energy in the medical school because everyone was new. You spoke to all the lecturers on their first name basis, and you knew pretty much everyone in the medical school because there was only 80 students a year, I think, so it wasn't very big.
Okay, so you joined the anaesthetic training program 1988, is that right?
Yes, yeah.
And then the following year you joined the Air Force.
Yeah, in 1990, at the end of 1990, I joined the Air Force. So why?
Yes.
I, as a youngster, had entertained the idea of becoming a pilot in the Air Force. I thought that was, a really cool thing to do. And then I discovered I really didn't have the eyesight to become a pilot, so I had to reset my expectations, and medicine became an option.
What happens when you become a specialist and you're in the reserve?
Well, in the Air Force, you then transferred over to a branch called the Specialist Reserve.
Okay.
And then your role is much more defined as a specialist doctor, and that's what you do. So you're no longer attached to a squadron per se, rather you enter a pool of specialist doctors who are available to do missions as required. And for me that involved doing a number of medical retrievals, including getting picked up from Coolangatta Airport at midnight in a Hercules and flying to Bougainville to retrieve a soldier who'd been electrocuted, and then flying him back to Townsville. I did a bit of teaching for the junior doctors on how to do aeromedical evacuation, and opportunities come up for deploying as an anaesthetist in an exercise. So K92, which was exercise Kangaroo 92, I was the aeromedical evacuation doctor for the whole of the top end during a big military exercise.
So let's talk about the deployments that you've done with the Air Force, starting with Bougainville, I think.
Yeah, so interestingly, I joined the Air Force in 1990. I did a number of exercises with them, which were all valuable because it helped you to understand the equipment, the processes, what it's like to be on deployment and work with the military, because it is a very different world. There's a rank structure that you have to work within, there's rules that you have to follow. Often we're dealing with equipment which can be potentially dangerous. My first deployment was to Bougainville, which was as part of the Australian government's peace monitoring group. Bougainville, I'm not sure if you remember, Bougainville was is a part of Papua New Guinea, but ethnically the people of Bougainville are Solomon Islanders. I'm not going to go more into the politics of it than that, but eventually, after a fairly messy and ugly civil war, which a lot of people were killed, they brokered a peace deal, and the Australian government sent troops along with the New Zealand government and the Fijian government to provide peace monitoring for that process. We were set up in some tents inside a great big ore shed which had a concrete floor, which was good because it was tropical, so we used to get downpours most afternoons, but we were able to stay dry. It was hot, it was humid, and luckily it wasn't very busy. Our most valuable asset is the hospital, because we weren't armed, the soldiers didn't take weapons, and what provided the security to us was if any of the locals needed medical help, they could get a surgical facility at their doorstep, and that was incredibly valuable.
And what was it like coming back from your first deployment?
It was interesting. It was only a short time. It wasn't particularly intensive. It was kind of like going away on a camp with a bunch of people you didn't know, doing a bit of stuff that you knew how to do.
And after that, what was your next deployment?
So that was in 1999. In 2000, I went to East Timor as part of the United Nations response to the troubles in East Timor.
Yep.
Which I think everyone's pretty familiar with. And we were there as part of the UN military hospital, and we were set up in the museum of all places.
Oh, okay.
And that was really, my first opportunity to take a medical command role. And it was interesting. The teams were all really good. Everyone was well drilled. And so I actually just went around quietly speaking to each of the wounded people and just telling them what was going on. I remember one guy, he had a pneumothorax and some burns, and so we took him to theatre first. And afterwards we were sitting around, because they'd all recovered and everyone done well, and they were recounting to us this experience that they had where they had contact with the enemy, and there was live fire in both directions. Because Timor, we all carried loaded weapons. And they were recounting how they were shooting at people and grenades were being thrown and that sort of stuff, and it sounded just absolutely scary. And I said, there's no way I could do that. And he said, oh, that's nothing. When I came in after I'd been blown up, he said, there was all these people going around and my head is spinning. And then there was this really calm voice in my ear saying, everything's fine, it's all under control, and you'll be well looked after. And I said, I heard that and I just relaxed, because that guy sounded like he knew what was going on. And I said, oh yeah, that was me. And he said, yeah, that was just amazing. I don't know how you did that. You sounded so calm and so relaxed, and it was so reassuring for me to hear that I just let people look after me, and it made all the difference for me. And he said, I don't know how you do that. And I said, we're trained for different jobs, aren't we?
So that being your first experience of carrying a weapon and being effectively in a dangerous place, was that more confronting?
It was very confronting. And whilst I was there, an Australian soldier was actually killed. He was in the back of an armoured personnel carrier, and his weapon fell off the rack and, for whatever reason, discharged and shot him through the chest. And he arrived at our facility already in a body bag because he hadn't survived. And we had to examine him and, look at his body. And he was just a young man who had a family and who was in the prime of his life and was accidentally killed by one of these weapons. Yeah. So that really, I think, was a pretty confronting experience, and certainly reminded you that this wasn't just all beer and Skittles, and it wasn't a holiday, and it was real.
Yeah. And then after that came the Solomon Islands a few years later?
Yes, so that was 2003 or 4, I think, and that was the regional assistance mission to the Solomon Islands. We went there to help out the Solomon Islands government, and I was part of the first push into that particular event. And it was before we had a field hospital set up on the Solomon Islands, and so the medical facility, the surgical facility, was actually on board HMAS Manura. And
then not long after that was the Tsunami.
Yes.
Which was a different sort of deployment altogether, wasn't it?
So, Boxing Day 2004, I had all my family staying with me at home in Lismore. Up comes the news of this terrible tsunami. At that time, I was chair of the Anaesthesia Consultative Group for the Defence Force. So I got on the phone and rang Tony Austin, who's the Air Vice Marshal, and I said, Tony, or Sir, this has happened, do you want a response from the Defence Force anaesthetists? And he said, at this stage we don't know, it's very early days, but if you could use your network to find people who would be prepared to deploy to wherever we need to send them, that would be really handy. So I sent out an email to everyone on my email list, which was basically all of the Defence Force anaesthetists, saying who would be available to go at short notice to provide support. I think I had about 10 or 12 people who immediately put up their hand and said, yep, we'll go. And so I sent that list through to Tony Austin, and he sent back a list of 4 anaesthetists saying, these are the 4 I want to send. So I was on that list. Paul Duncan, Paul Luckin and Brian Bazzuti. So 2 Navy, 1 Army and 1 Air Force. And he said, these are the 4 anaesthetists I want. Be ready to go by the 28th. We packed our bags and we waited to be told what to do. So I remember sitting in the passenger lounge at Richmond Air Force Base, and on the news was almost a constant feed about what had happened with the disaster. At that time, I didn't know where Banda Aceh was. No one appreciated that the top end of Sumatra had been hit as badly as it was. People were talking about Thailand. They were talking about death tolls in the order of, I think, 28,000 at that time. And we then got a briefing. The TV was turned off. We were told we were going to Banda Aceh, which was at the top end of Sumatra, and that both the surgical teams would be combined together. The medical teams, or the public health teams, were being sent. One was to Sri Lanka, I think one was to India, and that we'd all be deploying out of different aircraft at different times, but that's what our mission was. And so we then walked out across the tarmac, got on board the grey-painted 707 and took off to Jakarta. We overnighted in Jakarta, and the next morning, after a bit of mucking around, we flew to Banda Aceh, where we arrived just on sunset. And as we flew across the city, you could see out through the windows of the aircraft this city, which the first 2 or 3 kilometres were still underwater. They were still inundated. There was water everywhere. And clearly a lot of damage had happened. We landed. By the time we got off the aircraft, it was dark. I think it was about 25 of us. We unloaded 36,000 pounds of stores off the aircraft by hand in the heat. And we just stacked it all by the side of the runway. And then we set up some tents right close next to that and slept the night in our clothes, in the heat and the noise and everything else. The next morning, some teams went in, we found some trucks, and the military reconnaissance teams had identified 2 hospitals which hadn't been damaged by the earthquake or the tsunami, both of which had literally had missed the wave by only hundreds of metres. And we set up our facilities in those 2 places. And then for the next 8 days, operated madly on everything that came in. Anyone who got caught in the tsunami, they either died because they drowned or because all of the debris that was in it just smashed them to pieces. A very small number of people weren't killed, and they often had lower limb wounds. Any fracture was a compound fracture, any wound was just terribly infected. And we spent a lot of our time just debriding really horribly infected wounds, and any compound lower limb injury resulted in an amputation because that was the only option you had. Delayed primary closure for everything we did. And we had very limited anaesthesia equipment, and most of the anaesthetics we did were ketamine. Paul Luckin, who I worked with, we shared an operating room, and Paul was brilliant. He'd been an ambulance officer prior to starting medical school in South Africa. And he said, let's just take this one big operating room and put 2 tables in it because we don't have assistants. We can assist each other, we can support each other, we can work together to help each other. And it was just brilliant that he suggested that. And Paul and I are lifelong friends as a result of that shared hardship. We kind of knew each other peripherally before that, but sharing that experience was really important. I think both of us had patients who didn't survive the surgery, which was challenging. Both of us had lots of really complex cases. I think the team did 108 operations in 8 days, which included something like 20 amputations. With minimal equipment under very trying circumstances. We had aftershocks. I think we had a 7.3 aftershock while we were there. The lights came on, they came off, they came on. The air conditioning sometimes worked, but mostly didn't. We had a really very difficult time of it. And every time we drove to and from where we were staying to work, there would be rows of black body bags full of people who hadn't survived, who were just being dug out from under the debris. And every day you'd come to the hospital and there'd be a row of body bags outside waiting to be picked up and taken away to be buried in mass graves. And every afternoon when you finished, there'd be another row of them. And almost everyone we looked after survived, apart from the two that didn't. And most of them went on to go on and survive the whole experience. I remember one young lady had this most amazing degloving injury across her forehead, and it was just a horrible wound which needed cleaning up. We looked after her and we fixed up her wound, and luckily on the face the blood supply is so good that a primary closure was able to be done. And then we arranged for her to be medevaced out using Air Force assets and to a town called Medan, which hadn't been affected. And in the process of moving her and asking her name, one of the Australian soldiers recognised her name and said, "There's been another person with a very similar name to you who we've moved." And it turned out we found her mum, and we were able to reunite her with her mother. And it was a really heartwarming experience to be able to do that. And I'm in the recovery room that we'd set up after we'd done these operations, and I'm checking on my patients, and this patient puts out his hand and takes it, and at that particular instance I actually had an interpreter with me. And he shook my hand and he said, "Thank you, are you American?" And I said, "No, I'm from Australia." And he says, "You come from Australia?" And I said, "Yeah, near Brisbane." And he said, "Why are you here?" And I said, "Well, we're here to help you." And he says, "But why have you come to help us?" And I said, "Because we're Australians, we look after our neighbours, we help our neighbours when they need us." And he said, he couldn't understand it.
So do you think anything that you had done in your training as a doctor or a member of the military had prepared you for that experience?
Yes and no. I think as doctors and as carers and as people who want to help look after people, it's part of our DNA. It's what we do. I think my training within the military leading up to that had prepared me to work in austere and difficult environments. I remember one day we drove across a bridge, the main river through Banda Aceh, and we looked out, and there was thousands of bodies just in the water that we knew with the next tide would be gone, and no one would ever be able to identify who they were. We had a truck driver one day, and I remember and we rode in the back of a truck to go to the hospital, and he was just sitting there with his head down looking at the ground, and we said, "What's wrong?" And he said, "Well, I wasn't with my family when the wave hit. I was on the eastern side of town, and I have nobody left. All 30 members of my family are gone, and I don't know what to do. And I'm doing this because it helps me not think about the fact that I have no family left." And so many of the survivors of that disaster were like that. I think the official death toll after the tsunami was something like 280,000.
It's incomprehensible, isn't it?
Yeah.
But it understandably took its toll on you later.
Yeah. So one of the hard things about doing these sorts of missions is you take yourself out of your life in Australia where everything's good. You go to these places where everything's the complete antithesis of that. And then at the end of it, they stick you on a plane, they fly you home, they make a bit of a song and dance about you when you land back in Australia, and then you go home. And it's almost impossible to share with anyone what it's like. But the hardest things is when people say to you, "So you're back, did you have fun?" And I know they're trying to have a conversation with you about it, but that just kind of like, really? How can you ask that? Nothing about that was fun. But I was increasingly struggling with reintegrating back into normal life because things like if I saw a black plastic bag that had a body in it. I remember going to the cinema and walking out of the cinema afterwards into the light and looking down the street and going, "This doesn't look right. There's no debris, there's no bodies, there's just cars and people." And it's like, it really impacted on me in ways that I didn't understand. And I became increasingly angry. I became increasingly short-fused. I would lose it at relatively minor things that previously wouldn't have troubled me, or if they did trouble me, I'd manage it. And I would just lose my temper really easily. And about, I guess, 6 months later, I realised I had PTSD. And I was given a phone number to contact, and if I felt I was having troubles dealing with all of these things. And that phone number, the first time I rang it, it rang out, and the second time it went to a fax number. So I sent a fax and said, I think I need help, and nothing happened. So what does one do in that situation? And where I went to was, well, clearly I don't have a problem because no one's taking it seriously. And so I think I spiralled even worse into the whole PTSD space. And then one day I was talking to the department secretary, and she said to me, so-and-so hasn't got a job yet. He was one of our fellows, and he was a great fellow. He was a really good registrar for us. And he hasn't got a job yet. To this day, I don't know why, but I thought, here's an opportunity. I really just need to take myself out of this life and out of where I am and go and do something, because I'm just getting increasingly angry. I was scaring my children, and no one seemed to be able to help me. And that was part of the problem. The anger was part of the problem, because when people said, you need help, what would I do?
Yeah, get angry.
I'd get angry.
Yeah.
And so this opportunity presented itself. So I rang this registrar up and said, would you be interested in being a locum for me for 6 months? And they said, sure, love the place, love living up there, it's a great job. And so they said, I'll take the job on. And then I rang up a guy who I'd worked with when I was working in Boston. And I said, Jeff, I need some time out from my life. Would you happen to have a position available in your hospital? And he said, well, funny you should ask that. We've actually got one of our attendings has taken a sabbatical, and we actually need someone for 6 months, and we'd love to have you. And so in 2 phone calls, I organised a sabbatical to UC Davis in Sacramento. And I was given the post of visiting professor, and I basically removed myself completely from my life and my responsibilities and everything else around me, and went by myself to Sacramento and spent the next 6 months doing a completely different job. And as part of that, I went and found some self-help books and did a bit of reading, and I found this book which really helped me. And at the end of the book, it said, if this book has helped you, there's a psychological therapy program associated with it called Imago Therapy. And so I got on the computer and I Googled Imago therapists in Sacramento, and I found a guy. I rang him up and I said, can I have an appointment with you? And he said, sure. And so I made that appointment, and I was still a very angry person. And I remember driving to the appointment, and I got stuck in a traffic jam, and I was thinking like, I'm going to be late, and I was getting angry, and I was, and then, I don't know, a little voice in my head said, don't worry, you'll get there on time. And then the traffic cleared. And I drove, and I got there, and I sat down, and we started the therapy that I needed. And it went for a number of sessions. And then one day we got to talking about anger. And he said, so, why do you think you're angry? And we explored the anger and everything. And it turns out, through my military training, through my experiences of going to boarding school, because I grew up on a farm, I had to go to boarding school, an all-boys boarding school. What I was doing was I was turning whatever emotions I was feeling into anger. Because at a boarding school, you certainly can't wear your heart on your sleeve there. And in the military, the only permitted emotion is anger. So I was taking whatever I was feeling and turning it into anger, because anger was allowed. And anger was an emotion that I could have. And so that's what I did. And so when I felt lonely, or if I felt scared, or if I felt abandoned because no one took my calls, whatever I felt, I turned it into anger. It's something I've let go of.
Sure. But what does matter is what we can do about people in the future. And certainly our specialty has issues with PTSD, I believe, as well. We have an unnecessarily high incidence of mental illness and suicide among anaesthetists. Do you think that there's something to be learnt from your experience?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And I think part of it is, first of all, understanding someone, and particularly males, when they're getting angry, what they're really doing is crying out for help. Because it makes them unapproachable, obviously, but that anger is really, in most guys, is about a cry for help because I can't process my other emotions. And men just don't process emotions the same way as women do, mostly. And I think that it's about accepting those emotions, it's about normalising those emotions and saying they're actually okay to have. And for me, whenever I felt myself getting angry after that time, I would just go, okay, what's the real emotion you're feeling? What's really going on with you? And you would just have to name it. And they say, oh yeah, so I'm feeling quite lonely right now. Okay. And the anger would dissolve. And acknowledging your emotions actually allowed me to move on. And so I don't get angry very much anymore because there's very few things that I need anger for. Because anger is an emotion about self-preservation, really. And we live in a very peaceful country, so I don't need to get angry. Whilst I was president of the society, one of the opportunities that came up was the Every Mind project that Tracy Tay brought to us that needed some support, and that's now out there as a tool for normalising the psychological aspects of what we're doing, and for being able to talk about how you feel, everyone in the department, and being able to say there's no weakness associated with talking about how you feel, and there's no wrongness, and there's no lack of professionalism with being able to talk about how you feel. It's actually really important. Certainly the toolkit that Every Mind has got out there is something I would encourage everyone to go and look at and work out how you can integrate that into your life and how you can have your own mental health hygiene and also how you can help your colleagues. You know, one of the things I learnt from that whole experience was on my next deployment, which was a very confronting one, I was able to live in the moment. I was able to unload those emotional experiences. I was able to share them when I needed to. And I was able to recognise what I was feeling and how that impacted on me. And so the next big deployment for me was going to the Middle East, going to Afghanistan. And I discussed it with my wife, and I recognised that it was a dangerous thing for me to do because I'd already had PTSD. Would going on this deployment rekindle that, make it worse? Or since I felt pretty much recovered, or certainly had a whole new set of tools to manage it, would it be the thing I needed to do to say, you're actually over it? We deployed with the Dutch to a place called Tarin, which is like smack in the middle of Uruzgan province in Afghanistan, surrounded by mountains, from which the local Taliban used to regularly fire rockets at us. We had suicide bombers, and it was the operations base for where the Australian forces went out and did fighting. So often we'd hear combat, you hear gunfire daily, you'd hear gunfire daily in the base, and occasionally explosions. And then the Dutch had a howitzer there which used to fire out very large bullets, 20 or 30 kilometres out. And whenever they went off, it was you jumped out of your skin because it was a very loud noise. But we were there, we did something like 170 traumas in that period. I think a third of them were NATO forces and 2/3 were Afghan nationals. Half of those were children. But it was a great team, and we saved almost everyone. Certainly all of the NATO soldiers survived and went home, and many of them actually deployed again.
So what did you do about your mental health when you got home?
My mental health while I was there was actually the important part of this, I think. I shared a room with a guy who I'd actually worked with in Lismore, who was a scrub nurse. Every morning I got up early and exercised for an hour, then did my ablutions, had breakfast, and then I gave myself a half hour every day to myself, where I sat down and I wrote out in my diary what had happened the day before. And so I mentally unloaded all of yesterday's trauma and experiences and stresses and everything else that went on onto a piece of paper, and that's where it stayed. And so every day I hit the reset button. And if something was challenging, I'd talk about it with the commanding officer or Les or whoever, and just sort of go through what happened, and we supported each other. I did my debrief back at Richmond Air Force Base with the psychologist, and he said, so we're here, did you see any disturbing images or anything while you're on deployment? I said, well, I'm an anaesthetist, I worked in the hospital, I saw lots of things. And he said, okay, this is going to take a while. And I guess I talked for about an hour about my experiences and what had happened. And at the end of it, he just sat there and shook his head. And I said, what's wrong? And he said, well, you've just described to me the textbook recovery from PTSD. But what I think is really amazing is that you worked it all out for yourself. You found your own help, you found your own support, and you did it. And it's really amazing. Well done. And for me, that was a really affirming moment in my life, because it was like, okay, I am better from this, and I'm now able to talk about it. Sometimes I still tear up a bit, and that's okay.
That's normal?
I think so. It's kind of healthy.
If we fast forward to you then deciding to become president of the ASA, do you think that was influenced at all by all these experiences?
Yeah, look, I do. I had taken a role as executive counsellor of the ASA back in 2006, and so I'd had a role on the board in the past, and so that qualified me to become president. But certainly my experiences and I guess my profile within the profession helped make me someone who might want to be the candidate for it.
You then had a perfect opportunity to do something about helping with the welfare of anaesthetists as an office bearer. What do you think we should do? Do you think it should be part of our training that we should learn some of these techniques?
Yes. And I think that's where this toolkit that we've developed is really important. What we need to do, I think, is to look at the professionals in mental health and ask them what it is we need to do. And that's what the Every Mind project was about. It was about seeking professional advice on how to do it. And it sets up a framework about how to look at how we deal with mental health within our department. And I think that's how we need to do this. We need to recognise we're not experts, but at the same time we need to recognise that we have a role as leaders. Certainly as any consultant should have a role as a leader in looking after younger consultants and trainees when we talk about mental health. Recognise the things that trigger problems. So if you have a bad outcome, if you have a complication, if you get investigated by a statutory body, they're the sorts of things that we need to, that should be a red flag to everyone to say, this person is going to need some extra support. What resources do we have at hand, and what resources can we mobilise to support that person to do that? And I think we need to recognise these are the things that need to concern us. So, when we talk to a patient about their health and we talk about their cardiovascular function, their exercise tolerance, they're the flags that we're used to identify and to say, we need to do something more for this patient. I think as anaesthetists, as anaesthesiologists, we need to be thinking about what are the red flags that we need to identify for our colleagues to look after them. And this resource helps us to identify those. When we talk about resiliency training, what we're really talking about is dealing with disappointment. And how do we help people to deal with disappointment? And I think that is really what we should be focusing on so much with both younger and older people, is when you are disappointed because something hasn't worked out the way you wanted it to, for whatever reason. How do we help people deal with that disappointment is really a big part of moving on and getting over it, and building resiliency. Because once you've learned how to deal with disappointment, once you've learned how to deal with things not going the way you want them to, but can still move on, then you've actually got resiliency, because that's what it is.
And it's something that's not taught to children anymore.
Indeed. Well, my kids learned it, but
yes.
But then they had to deal with a very angry dad for a while to get over that.
Yes.
And I frightened my children through part of their growing up. But now we have a wonderful relationship. We get on very well, and we share a lot of feelings about what's going on in our lives.
And presumably part of your recovery is down to the fact that you had a supportive family that did help you through that.
Well, so interestingly, I didn't let them support me.
Okay.
And that was part of the problem. When I worked out what was going on and then came back to them, the true support was welcoming me back into the family. Yes. And that's where that was the really valuable part of it, was they said, yeah, you're a different person now, we'll have you back. And that was really nice. Yeah,
that's lovely. Well, David, thank you so much for coming and for sharing all those stories with us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for the opportunity.